In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at using that aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to explore the impact of monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policy has to do with changes in the money supply, or changes in how the banking system works, but at its most fundamental level, it's simply changes in the money supply. Fiscal policy has to do with the spending and taxing decisions of the government. So that has to do with G and it has to do with T that we've talked about earlier in the class. So we're going to be thinking about the effect that those have on that aggregate demand curve. And we know already, we've talked a little bit about them. We know that the government can move that aggregate demand curve by changing government spending, G, or it can move the aggregate demand curve by changing the money supply. Now, the money supply is not controlled by politicians. The money supply is controlled by the Fed, and we have tried to insulate the Fed from the political process. So politicians don't get to play around with the money supply. But we already know a little bit about what we're going to be talking about in this particular chapter. What we're going to do is focus a lot on the interest rate effect. So let's go back for just a second and just quickly review why the aggregate demand curve slopes down. We talked about 3 reasons that the aggregate demand curve slopes down. Remember that Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports, and G is under the control of the government. So what we want to do in order to understand why the aggregate demand curve looks like this, here's aggregate demand, here's real GDP, here's the price level. What we want to do is we want to think about why a change in the price level would cause consumers overall to want to buy more or less stuff. So if we started with a price level of P1, we could look at the total amount of goods and services that consumers want to buy in the economy. It's Y1. If we decrease the price level or thought about a lower price level, we would see that consumers want to buy a higher quantity. Now, we talked in an earlier chapter about the fact that a change in a monetary variable in the long run doesn't affect a real variable. But keep in mind, throughout that chapter in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we were thinking about this as a short-run model. So in order to explain this relationship between the price level and real GDP, the amount of stuff people want to buy, we thought about how the price level would impact consumption. And we talked about the wealth effect. What we said was that a lower price level makes people feel wealthier, and when they feel wealthier, they go out and they buy more stuff. We also talked about the interest rate effect, the effect that the price level would have on investment, and what we saw there was that when the price level goes down, you don't need to have as many dollars to engage in transactions, so you lend some of your dollars out, and lending your dollars out causes that interest rate to go down. And when the interest rate goes down, firms want to borrow more to engage in investment, so a decrease in the price level causes investment to go up. And then we talked about that net export effect. And the net export effect says that when you decrease the price level, that causes the dollar to become weaker. And we don't need to worry about why. There's several steps of logic there, but when the dollar becomes weaker, that stimulates people in other countries, from other countries, to buy stuff from us, because when the dollar gets weaker, other currencies get stronger, and those other currencies can now buy more goods and services from us. And so a decrease in the price level causes net exports to go up. So all 3 of those are reasons that the aggregate demand curve slopes down. In this chapter, we're going to think a lot about the interest rate effect, because the interest rate effect ends up being bigger than the wealth effect or that net export effect. So we're going to be focusing on that. In order to do that, what we want to do is we want to think about what's known as the theory of liquidity preference. Theory of liquidity preference. it's going to help us understand what causes the interest rate to fluctuate. Now, you might think back and say, we've already talked about a model that helped us understand why the real interest rate would go up and down. It was that model where we had the demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds. And that model does help us understand what causes the real interest rate to go up and down, but that's a long-run model. What we're going to be thinking about now is a short-run model. Okay? So we're going to think about the theory of liquidity preference, meaning, remember, liquidity is the ease with which an asset can be converted into the economy's medium of exchange. So you have different preferences in terms of liquidity. And we'll talk about that. Let's start by thinking about the first half of this model. This model is just going to be a demand-supply model, like we've been talking about throughout this class. So it will be a little bit new, but the foundation of it you already know. One half of it, the first half of it, is the money supply. And this half is actually very easy. We've talked about something like this before. What we're going to do is we're going to explore the relationship between the interest rate and the quantity of money. So this is going to be our interest rate. And down here's the quantity of money. Now this is money supplied that we're thinking about. And the quantity of money that's available out there, the money supply, we're going to act like it's completely controlled by the Fed. Now we know that the Fed does not have complete control over it. We talked about that earlier in the semester. But we're going to pretend, to make this simple, that they do. That means that the money supply is just going to be a vertical line. The money supply is what it is. It's this quantity. Whatever the quantity the Fed determines, it's going to be that quantity. And it doesn't matter if the interest rate is low or the interest rate is high. So I'm going to call this, we could abbreviate it MS for money supply. And again, we've seen that before. The interesting part of this model is going to have to do with money demand. And we've talked about that before, but this will be slightly different. Money demand. The money demand curve, when we draw it in this space, is when we have the interest rate up here and we have the quantity of money down here. Let's think our way through this in terms of the amount of money that you want to hold. Remember that in order to engage in transactions, you need to have some money. That money doesn't have to be currency. Remember, the definition of money is that it's all of the assets in an economy that are regularly used to engage in transactions. So this can be money in your checking account that you use a debit card for. It can be currency. If you carry some around, you could write a check. The higher the interest rate, the smaller the quantity of money you're going to want to hold in your checking account. And the reason there is that the interest rate is the opportunity cost of holding money. It's the amount of money that you give up because you're not going to be lending your money out. So if the interest rate is high, all other things equal, you're going to want to hold less money. You're going to want to lend more money out because there's a greater reward to lending it out. If the interest rate is low, then you're not missing out on much by holding your money in a checking account, so you don't care about holding a lot. So all other things equal, you would hold a higher quantity at lower interest rates. So the money demand curve, I'll just abbreviate it MD, the money demand curve looks just like we would expect the money demand curve to look. So here what we're doing is thinking about your demand for liquidity. You hold money because it is liquid. If you're thinking about how to hold wealth as you save for your retirement later, what you're going to realize is there are lots of ways to hold wealth. You could hold wealth by buying a house and taking care of it, or buying land, or buying stocks and bonds, or buying other assets. And all of these assets are going to have different measures of liquidity. A house is extremely illiquid. You can't go and buy groceries with a house, but it can have a very high real rate of return compared to other assets as long as you take care of it. So you have to decide how you want to hold your wealth, and you might want to hold some things in very illiquid assets because they tend to have a higher rate of return, but you're still going to need to hold some more liquid assets because they're more liquidity, even though they have a lower rate of return. And then you still want to hold some money because you've still got to pay rent, and you've got to buy gas, and you've got to buy groceries, and you've got to pay tuition. You've got to have money in an account to do that. And so all other things equal, the higher the interest rate, the less money you want to hold because you're going to be willing to give up some liquidity because you can get that higher interest rate. So that's the idea behind the money demand curve. The higher the interest rate, the higher the opportunity cost of holding money, and therefore you hold less. So if we put these together, we get something we've seen many times over. We've got our interest rate up here, and we've got the quantity of money down here. We've got our money supply curve that's vertical. And we've got a downward sloping money demand curve. And the intersection of those is going to determine, I'll call it R star, the equilibrium interest rate. So we can think about what drives this model to R star. What if we had a different interest rate? Like what if we had an interest rate that was higher or an interest rate that was lower? Let's just consider that. Let's think about what would happen if we had an interest rate that was R1. Now, if we think about the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied of money at that particular interest rate, we see that at that interest rate, here's the quantity of money supplied, and here's the quantity of money demanded. We see that there's excess demand for money at that interest rate. And what that means is that people who want to lend money are going to need to drive up the interest rate. They're going to have to offer to pay more to get people to borrow money. And that upward pressure drives the interest rate up to R star until that shortage of money goes down. Okay? That excess demand for money goes down. So bond issuers are going to have to offer higher rates of return to get people to buy their bonds. Drives the interest rate up. So now we can think a little bit more about the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve. So if we think about what happens in terms of the interest rate when the price level changes, this will help us understand the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So if we think about what's going on there, let's look at, I'm going to put R up here for the interest rate. I'm going to put Q down here for the quantity of money. Let's put our money supply here. And let's put our money demand. And let's think about what happens. Let's put our initial interest rate up here, R1. What happens if the price level goes up? Okay. If the price level goes up, then that means that people need more dollars to engage in transactions, and that money demand curve is going to shift to the right. So it's going to shift from MD1 to MD2. And the interest rate is going to be driven up to R2. An increase in the price level will cause the interest rate to go up. Now, when the interest rate goes up, let's write out here our steps of logic. An increase in the price level causes an increase in money demand. People need more dollars to engage in transactions. That's going to lead to an increase in the interest rate. Let's write that out. Increase in interest rate. And when the interest rate goes up, the cost of borrowing also goes up, and so firms are going to borrow less, they're going to invest less. This has a downward effect on investment. And really all we're talking about here is the interest rate effect. This is visually what the interest rate looks like. If we were to think about the aggregate demand curve, this is part of why aggregate demand slopes down. If we think about the price level here, P1 let's call it, and we increase the price level, money demand shifts to the right, it drives up the interest rate, it drives down investment, and that's part of the reason that we have less goods and services bought and sold at a higher price level, is because that interest rate effect causes there to be less investment. Let's think now about what happens in terms of the money supply. Okay, so remember when we were talking about the things that shift the aggregate demand curve, I snuck in there the money supply, and we didn't talk about it at the time. What I said was, we'll discuss this in the next video, but for right now I just want you to know that the money supply, if the Fed changes it, then that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve. Let's think about why that happens. So in order to do that, let's draw a couple of pictures here. Let's draw one here and one here. And in this picture, I'm going to have the money demand, money supply picture. So let's have our money supply. We're going to increase the money supply, so we'll call it MS1. And we've got our money demand. We're not going to worry about changing it. Let's identify the initial interest rate, R1, and the initial quantity. It's right there. We're not going to change that. And you can see that if the money demand curve shifts or the money supply curve shifts, then we're going to move to a new equilibrium. We could identify a quantity down there, but it's going to be that quantity. It's the money supply. Down here, let's think about our aggregate demand, aggregate supply pictures. So we've got a downward sloping aggregate demand, and let's just pick a particular price level. We're not going to change the price level. So we could look at the quantity demanded at that price level. It's going to be Y1. So what we're doing in this example, we're not going to be thinking about changing the price level. As a matter of fact, let's, I was going to put a bar over it to indicate that it's not changing, but we'll just leave it like it is. So now we've got our aggregate demand curve. What we want to do is think about the impact of a change in the money supply. Why does a change in the money supply shift that aggregate demand curve? So let's shift the money supply to the right. So the Fed has injected some money into the system. Here's money supply 2. What we know is that that's going to drive down the interest rate. So the interest rate is going to fall to R2. When the interest rate falls to R2, that means there's more investment taking place. And so at that price level, which we have not changed, instead of there being Y1 level of GDP, there's going to be more goods and services bought because investment goes up. It's going to go up to, let's say, Y2. What that means is that the entire aggregate demand curve has shifted to the right, from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2. So an increase in the money supply, the Fed increasing the money supply, shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right because that increase in the money supply drives down the interest rate, it stimulates investment, and that means at every price level there's more investment than there was before. Notice that I just picked a particular price level, but what's happening is this GDP goes up at every price level. At this price level it goes up by that amount, and at that price level, and that price level, and this one down here. So don't be confused by why I identified this price level. this is happening at every price level. I just picked one so that you could see it. Okay? So we've thought about, when we were discussing the Fed, we talked about the fact that the money supply is the Fed's main tool that it uses to influence the economy. They can actually also change interest rates. We talked about the federal funds rate, and the federal funds rate is the rate that one bank charges another bank to borrow money from it. What we discussed there and what we're discussing here, nothing's really changed, because what the Fed does to change those interest rates is it changes the money supply. And so sometimes you'll hear people talk about the Fed setting an interest rate target as opposed to changing the money supply. Well, the way that they're going to achieve that target, the way they're going to hit that target, is they're going to hit it by changing the money supply through open market operations. So this helps us understand more about why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward, and hopefully more about why the money supply causes aggregate demand to shift to the right. What we want to do now is think about how fiscal policy affects aggregate demand, and it's actually very straightforward. So I'll clear this off and we'll talk about that. So let's think about the effect of fiscal policy now. So remember that Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. So if we think about fiscal policy, part of fiscal policy has to do with changing government spending, the amount of money that the government, whether it's the federal government or state and local governments, whether it's the amount of money they spend on things like roads or national defense, things like that. So if we think about changes in government purchases, then that we know shifts the aggregate demand curve directly. So we've got our aggregate demand curve, and if the government were to increase G, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2. It shifts it directly. If the government changes the level of taxes, then that's going to shift it. It's a little bit more indirect, because what happens is if the government increases taxes, then consumption's going to go down. Consumers are going to have less dollars in their pockets to spend. If the government increases taxes on firms, then that's going to cause investment to go down. And so an increase in taxes would shift aggregate demand to the left, and a decrease in taxes would shift aggregate demand to the right. So this picture could represent a decrease in taxes. So with a change in government purchases, it's very easy to see that because it shows up by itself in this national income identity. A change in taxes, it's still pretty straightforward, but it's a little more indirect because it changes the amount of consumption and investment that's going to take place. The question that we have to think about is, how much does a change in government purchases affect the aggregate demand curve? So if we had a change in government spending of, say, $10 billion, suppose the government buys some new fighter jets or something like that. The question is, how much does that shift the aggregate demand curve? Does it shift it by $10 billion or more than $10 billion, or does it shift it by less than $10 billion? And so in order to answer that question, we need to think about what we're going to call the multiplier effect. And this is going to be very similar to what we did with the money multiplier back when we were thinking about how much a new deposit into the banking system would end up, how much money it would end up creating in terms of the money supply. So if you think about the multiplier effect, what happens, let's suppose the government spends $10 billion on some fighter jets. Then the company that makes the $10 billion, or makes the fighter jets, is going to get that money. They're going to be paying their workers with that money, and they're going to be buying the materials that they need to make the jets with that money. And then the workers who are now paid the dollars, they're going to go out and spend those dollars on other things. They're going to buy things from stores, and the people who own the stores that sold those things are going to have some new money in their pockets, and they're going to go out and buy stuff. And so you can see that it's not just the initial $10 billion. It's going to have kind of a ripple effect through the economy. So what we need to think about is how big is that ripple effect? And your book goes through illustrating how that's determined. What we're going to do is we're going to just kind of jump to the end, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. First, we need to define one thing, and that is the marginal propensity to consume. And so let's define that. Marginal propensity to consume. We're going to abbreviate it MPC, marginal propensity to consume. We can also think about the marginal propensity to save. I'll show you that here in just a second. The marginal propensity to consume is just the fraction of extra income that a household chooses to consume rather than save. So if you get another dollar of income and you choose to spend 3/4 of it and save 1/4, then the marginal propensity to consume would be 3/4. The marginal propensity to save would be 1/4. So the marginal propensity to save is 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, so here's what the multiplier looks like. Multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. That's the multiplier, the government spending multiplier. So let's do an example. Let's suppose the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 3/4. So the multiplier will be equal to 1 over 1 minus 3/4. 1 minus 3/4 is just 1/4. So this is 1 over 1/4. And this is a fraction over a fraction. Remember, you've got to take the denominator, flip it over, and multiply it by the numerator. That just gives you a multiplier of 4. Probably an easier way to remember the multiplier, once you understand that the marginal propensity to save is 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, you could write the multiplier this way. It's just 1 over the marginal propensity to save. And then just do the calculation. Typically in a problem, I will give you the marginal propensity to consume. But if you know that the marginal propensity to consume is 3/4, in your head you can figure out that the marginal propensity to save then has to be 1/4. And then all you have to do is flip over the marginal propensity to save. It's just the inverse of the marginal propensity to save. Okay? So, marginal propensity to consume is very straightforward, and it's not just restricted to the impact of a change in government spending. This also works for changes in consumption, investment, and net exports. So let's suppose there's a recession in Europe, and that recession in Europe results in a decrease in net exports, in our net exports. We end up selling less to people in Europe on net. Then if we want to figure out how much that's going to shift our aggregate demand curve to the left, we can figure out how much net exports decline, and then figure out what the multiplier is, and then you would take that multiplier and multiply it by the decrease in net exports. Let's do that. So I just a second ago talked about the government increasing government spending by $10 billion. Then once we've figured out that our multiplier is 4, We take the 10 billion, multiply it by the 4, that will have a $40 billion shift in aggregate demand. That's how you would use the multiplier. So you just figure out how much consumption or investment or net exports changes by, and then multiply it by the multiplier, and that'll give you the total shift in aggregate demand. We also need to talk about something that we call the crowding out effect. Crowding out effect. And the idea here is that an increase in government spending is going to have a multiplier effect on aggregate demand, but there's also some crowding out that goes on. And so here's how we would think about that. An increase in government spending is going to end up causing an increase in the interest rate, which causes a decrease in investment. I'll just put I, which ends up causing a decrease in aggregate demand. So when we think about the multiplier effect, we have to keep in mind that there's this other thing, this crowding out effect, that works against the multiplier effect. So we can't just say that an increase of $10 billion in government spending times the multiplier gives us 40 billion, because there's going to be a little bit of a decrease in aggregate demand that offsets that. And that comes about by the fact that the increase in government spending is going to drive the interest rate up, decrease investment. So while this goes up by a lot, this is going to go down by a little bit. So there's some crowding out. Let's talk about now changes in taxes. We've talked about half of fiscal policy, the changes in spending. Let's talk about changes in taxes. So we can think about a tax cut. A tax cut means that households have more money to spend. So households have more money to spend. Some is going to be saved, but some is going to be spent. So let's say that some is saved, some is spent. It depends on the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. Some is spent, and that increases aggregate demand. How much does it increase aggregate demand? Well, it depends upon the multiplier effect, of course. A tax increase shifts aggregate demand to the left. So again, we talked about it being kind of an indirect effect as opposed to a change in government spending. It is, because it changes consumption and it depends upon the marginal propensity to consume. The rest of the chapter has to do with kind of a discussion of the argument for and against active government intervention to stabilize the economy. And there's some disagreement amongst economists as to how much the government should try to intervene. There are many examples historically where the government trying to engage in stabilization through fiscal policy has not worked very well. There are other examples where it seems to have worked fine. And so there's room to disagree about whether or not the government should try to intervene in the economy and the extent to which they should try to do that. If the government intervention doesn't work, then clearly those dollars are just being wasted. They could be better used in some other way. But if it does work, then maybe there's a good reason to do it. And so, as I say, there's disagreement amongst economists. There's also at the very end of that chapter some discussion about some automatic stabilizers. You can take a look at that. I'm not going to talk about it in the video, and I don't think I've ever put a question on the test on the automatic stabilizers. So if you skipped it, that would be okay. So hopefully with this chapter, along with the previous chapter on aggregate demand and aggregate supply, you've got a better understanding of how the model, or how the market, how the economy, which is made up of lots of markets, how the economy functions, what causes it to go into a recession, what can cause it to go into an expansion, and some of the things that the government might think about doing to try to end recessions or keep us from going into a recession. So I hope you've enjoyed it.